West Berlin, where they were met by Vice President Johnson. That same month, Khrushchev resumed nuclear testing. When Kennedy learned of this, he erupted. Fucked again. Despite the U.S.'s nuclear superiority, the Air Force wanted to increase the missile count to 3,000. McNamara fought them down to 1,000 as the compromised number. The Soviets, by October, were detonating a 30-megaton bomb, the biggest yet exploded. And the next week, a 50-plus megaton bomb, over 3,000 times as powerful as the one dropped on Hiroshima. Kennedy had inherited by now the full wrath of Dulles' brinksmanship. To an outside observer, it might have seemed that Americans had taken leave of their senses in the summer and fall of '61 as the nation conducted an extended conversation on building fallout shelters in their homes, as well as the ethics of killing neighbors or friends to protect that shelter.
You got a bunch of your neighbors outside who want to stay alive. Keep on doing what you're doing and we'll bust our way in there.
Despite media pressure, surprisingly, few people actually built shelters, either out of a sense of numbed resignation or the recognition of the difficulties of a meaningful survival. Under Kennedy, and mostly unknown to the American public, the U.S. began resettling villagers at gunpoint in barbed wire enclosed compounds guarded by unreliable South Vietnamese government troops, and using herbicides to defoliate guerrilla areas. The long-term environmental and health effects would turn out disastrously for Vietnamese and Americans alike. But it would be the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962 that truly impressed upon Kennedy the potentially disastrous repercussions of his hardline Cold War policies. But it would be the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962 that truly impressed upon Kennedy the potentially disastrous repercussions of his hardline Cold War policies. On a Sunday, October 14th, a U-2 surveillance plane brought back photographic evidence of Soviet medium-range ballistic missiles in position in Cuba. It was quite a shock. Khrushchev had lied to him, promising no offensive weapons in Cuba, but he was making a blunder of epic proportions. The last thing the Soviets wanted in 1962 was a direct military confrontation with the U.S. With little more than 10 ICBMs that could reliably reach U.S. soil and fewer than 300 nuclear warheads, they stood no chance against the U.S.'s 5,000 deliverable nuclear bombs and nearly 2,000 ICBMs and bombers. Why did Khrushchev do this? The American public never understood. The media presented Soviet actions in Cuba as a case of outright Soviet aggression. Finally, the missiles were an inexpensive way for Khrushchev to placate those who questioned his leadership in the communist world. But it was so dangerous, what he did. So dangerous. In his thinking, Khrushchev had intended to announce the presence of the nuclear missiles on November 7th at the 45th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. But as military analyst Daniel Ellsberg has pointed out, by keeping secret the fact that he had delivered tactical cruise and ballistic missiles along with their nuclear warheads, Khrushchev had transformed a potentially effective means of deterring a U.S. invasion into a destabilizing provocation that backfired. The U.S. never understood the warheads had already arrived.
The whole point of the doomsday machine is lost. If you keep it a secret, why didn't you tell the world, eh?
It was to be announced at the Party Congress on Monday. As you know, the Premier loves surprises.
Even today, few realize the gravity of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and even fewer seem to grasp its enduring lessons. Dulles' legacy of brinksmanship, of going to the edge, had finally spawned its Frankenstein monster. 2 days later, Kennedy met with his key advisors in a top-secret meeting, hoping to stop the missiles before they were fully installed. 3 days later, on October 19th, he met with his Joint Chiefs. They pushed for a surgical airstrike without warning to remove the missiles, followed by an all-out invasion of Cuba. LeMay assured Kennedy that the Soviets would not respond. LeMay welcomed nuclear war as inevitable in a war that his country was currently in a position to win. There might not be a second opportunity. He fulminated against the Russian bear.
Let's take his leg off, right up to his testicles. On second thought, let's take his testicles too.
After the meeting, Kennedy remarked to his aide, Kenny O'Donnell,
"If we listen to them and do what they want us to do, none of us will be alive later to tell them that they were wrong."
With U.S. missiles in Turkey so close to the Soviet Union, McNamara contended that the strategic balance of power was not changed. Kennedy agreed, but understanding the political symbolism, said that allowing the missiles to stay would weaken the perception of the U.S. across the world, and especially in Latin America. He confided to his brother Robert that if he didn't take strong action now after what he did at the Bay of Pigs, he'd be impeached. This moment became a crucial test of Kennedy's character. On October 22, 8 days after the pictures were taken, Kennedy solemnly informed the American people.
All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, where they're found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back.
He portrayed the U.S. as an innocent victim of unprovoked Soviet aggression, not revealing that we've been fighting a terrorist war against Cuba since late 1959.
I know that some action should be taken, but he's going to have to tread very lightly, short of war.
Well, I think it's high time we stop Russia from having things her own way.
The temperature of the world shot up. People were on edge, transfixed to their televisions and radios. Children watched the news, their parents full of fear. That same day, the Strategic Air Command went to DEFCON 3. 2 days later, for the first time in history, to DEFCON 2, prepared to strike targets in the Soviet Union. The decision to go to the precipice of nuclear war was made under the authority given by Eisenhower by SAC Commander General Thomas Power without consulting the President. Thereafter, the SAC fleet remained airborne, refueled by aerial tankers. It was Power who, in 1960, told a defense analyst, "The whole idea is to kill the bastards. Look, at the end of the war, if there are 2 Americans and 1 Russian, we win." The analyst responded, "Well, you better make sure that they're a man and a woman." A series of harrowing incidents occurred, any one of which could have triggered a Holocaust. The SAC test missile was launched from the U.S. towards the Marshall Islands, and officials mistakenly reported that Tampa and Minnesota were under attack. On October 25, the Soviet leaders decided they would have to remove the missiles, but still hoped to trade them in Cuba for U.S. Jupiters in Turkey. Before they could act, a 42,000-strong Soviet force, commanded by a Stalingrad veteran and backed by 100,000 Cubans, possessed, unknown to American intelligence, approximately 100 battlefield nuclear weapons. Khrushchev was losing control of the situation. In an amazing moment, he asked his generals if they could guarantee that holding this course would not result in the death of 500 million people.
Now what good would it have done me in the last hour of my life to know that though our great nation and the United States were in complete ruin, the national honor of the Soviet Union was intact?
In what McNamara described as the most extraordinary diplomatic message I have ever seen. Khrushchev sent Kennedy an urgent letter asking simply for a promise not to invade Cuba. He warned that the two countries were heading inexorably towards war.
It would not be in our power to stop it. War ends when it has rolled through cities and villages everywhere, sowing death and destruction.
On October 27th, an incident occurred that Schlesinger described as not only the most dangerous moment of the Cold War, it was the most dangerous moment in human history. The Russian ships were heading toward the quarantine line. One of 4 Soviet submarines sent to protect the ships was being hunted all day by the carrier USS Randolph. More than 100 miles outside the blockade, the Randolph began dropping depth charges, unaware the sub was carrying nuclear weapons. The explosion rocked the submarine, which went dark except for emergency lights. The temperature rose sharply, the carbon dioxide in the air reached near lethal levels, and people could barely breathe. Men began to faint and fall down. The suffering went on for 4 hours. Then, the Americans hit us with something stronger. We thought, that's it, the end. Panic ensued. Commander Valentin Savitsky tried without success to reach the general staff. He assumed the war had already started and they were going to die in disgrace for having done nothing. He ordered the nuclear torpedo to be prepared for firing. He turned to the other 2 officers aboard. Fortunately for mankind, the political officer, Vasily Arkhipov, was able to calm him down and convince him not to launch, probably single-handedly preventing nuclear war. Soviet diplomats were burning their files in Washington and New York. Washington insiders had begun to quietly evacuate their families from the capital, telling wives and children to drive as far south as quickly as possible. In a last desperate effort, Kennedy sent his brother to meet with the Soviet ambassador, Anatoly Dobrinin, on that Saturday to tell him the United States was about to attack unless it received an immediate Soviet commitment to remove its bases from Cuba.
The United States will pledge to never invade Cuba or aid others in that enterprise.
If your Jupiter missiles in Turkey were removed also, such an accommodation could be reached.
That's not possible. The United States cannot agree to such terms under threat. Any belief to the contrary was in error.
You want war?
However, while there can be no quid pro quo on this issue, the United States can offer a private assurance. Now, our Jupiter missiles in Turkey are obsolete and have been scheduled for withdrawal for some time. This withdrawal should take place within, say, 6 months. Of course, any public disclosure of this assurance would negate the deal and produce the most stringent denials from our government.
This private assurance represents the word of the highest authority.
30 years later, in 1992, McNamara was shocked when told that if American troops had invaded, not only were there 4 times as many armed Soviets in Cuba as reported, but 100 battlefield nuclear weapons would likely have been used. Realizing that 100,000 Americans would probably have died, McNamara said the U.S. would have responded by wiping out Cuba with the high risk of an all-out nuclear war between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Hundreds of millions of people might have perished, possibly all mankind. It has recently been discovered that on the island of Okinawa, a large force of missiles with megaton nuclear warheads and F-100 fighter bombers armed with hydrogen bombs were preparing for action. Their likely target was not the Soviet Union, but China. Military leaders were furious when the crisis ended without an attack on Cuba. McNamara recalled their bitterness.
The president invited the chiefs in to thank them for their support during the crisis, and there was one hell of a scene. Curtis LeMay came out saying, "We lost, We ought to just go in there today and knock them off.
It was crucial.